Good morning, friends. I don't know about where you are, but where I am, the days are getting shorter, it's getting colder, and that means I can feel my seasonal affective disorder starting to rear up. Winter is coming. Sometimes it feels like winter is already here, even though I know that it's not yet officially here, or at least I don't think it is. Actually, I don't know exactly when winter starts, but it feels to me like winter is starting. Um, and so I'm sort of aware of every time that this time of year rolls around, I sort of start to fall into this like end of year angst where I can feel winter is coming. I start to worry about my mental health and how it's going to hold up this year. I'm also doing a bit of like reflecting back on my past year. And sometimes I feel great about that. And sometimes I feel not great about that. And that's not like what I mean by that is not something that I'm actively choosing to do. I just sort of like, as I feel the days getting shorter and the weather getting colder, I like can almost like feel the end of the year approaching, and that just sort of like reflexively brings up some of this stuff for me. It's also probably just like living in a culture that is very sort of like New Year's resolutions focused. That is definitely um, big on my mind. Sometimes I start to get anxious about resolutions. I don't really do New Year's resolutions anymore. I'm going to talk more about why I don't and what I have done instead. In the past, I sort of done it all. I have done New Year's resolutions. I've done like detailed goals. I've done sort of like generic resolutions. I've done the whole like fuck it, I'm not getting sucked into any of this like bullshit. I'm just gonna like be. One of my favorite things that I've done over the years was I've picked a word of the year. Back when I lived in New York City with a roommate, my roommate Christine turned me on to this. She would pick a different word of the year every year, and just sort of like let that be her like guiding light for the year. Some of my words in the year in the past have been edit. I really liked that one. Um, oh gosh, what other ones have there been? I know that there was one year where I was like, I'm going to do four, and it was structure, space, strength, and stride. Um, but like, I don't know. Um, this year, as the days are getting shorter and the year is winding down, I want to offer up something completely different for you and for me also as an end of year reflection. Because what I'm really thinking about a lot these days are how I can take better care of myself, and how I can better take care of my community. You know, in order to love God, you've got to love yourself and you've got to love your neighbor, right? And so I'm thinking about those two things, loving self and loving neighbor, and how they're both intimately connected to loving God and how they're both intimately connected to each other. So when it comes to loving self, some things that questions that I'm asking myself, and some questions that you might ask yourself are, what practices do you do regularly to take care of yourself? Physically, mentally, emotionally, financially, all of this is a part of taking care of yourself. And this feels like an important, I don't know, moment to remind you and to remind us all that loving yourself and loving your neighbor aren't two like separate pursuits. They often go hand in hand. Like, for instance, organizing a union in your workplace is self-care and it's community care. So often self-care or taking care of yourself or loving yourself gets, I don't know, reduced to these sort of like Instagrammable moments that are like very solo focused. It's like a bubble bath or a massage, but like balancing your budget can be self care. And like I said, organizing for a union can be self care. Asking for a raise can be self care. Like I don't know, we don't just like exist separate from our material circumstances. And it's, I think, a very privileged position to think like, oh, I can just sort of like wish and woo myself into sort of like self-care or better care, right? That like I think for me, self-care and community care go hand in hand, right? Like if you have chronic health conditions that like need treatment, it doesn't matter how many bubble baths you take or how many like Epsom salt soaks you do. Like what you need is like access to quality and affordable healthcare. If you have like I have ADHD, right? Like sometimes I need medication or sometimes I need a therapist or a psychiatrist help. Like I can't meditate my way out of my ADHD. Meditation, for the record, can really help. Journaling can help. There are practices that can support us. We aren't totally helpless, even when we can't, even when there are systemic barriers that get in the way of our care for ourselves. We aren't completely helpless. There are things that we can do, but I just like it just feels like really important to me, especially in this time of year where like I don't know, like resolutions and goal setting can be so personal focused and individual focused. That is like, a white supremacist capitalist lie, right? That like we're only responsible for ourselves and that we are ultimately totally in control of our own destiny rather than being part of an integrated and interconnected system of family and community and country and world. And so as we think about like loving self, I want us to think bigger than just sort of like these like micro self-care ideas and thinking about how that connects to the bigger picture. I think that is for those of you who are Christian or like me, Jewish, or people of faith, that feels like a really important space to be grounded in, that like taking care of ourselves is intimately interconnected with taking care of each other. And when we do that, when we take care of ourselves and each other, we are then connected to the divine. And I also like want to push back on the idea that taking care of others should come first or be foremost, or that you should take care of the others at the expense of yourself. Right? Like that's not it either. It's not that you like have to sacrifice yourself to take care of others. It's like a recognition that like we are all bound up in this together. So that was number one. I know there's a long number one, but like what practices do you do regularly to take care of yourself? Another question that you might ask yourself when it comes to loving yourself is, are you able to articulate your core values? Do you know like in your heart of hearts, like what you really believe in, what is like most important to you? Over in Sanctuary Collective, which if you don't know is our online community, we were talking about sort of our understandings of like God and the nature of God. And Adrian, who's a Sanctuary Collective member, he shared the other day that he actually has like a written out personal credo statement about like what he believes and what is important to him, that he reviews and he revises regularly. And a section of that is specifically about God for him. So like also, if you want to have if that type of conversation excites you and you want to be part of that type of conversation, we would love to have you inside of Sanctuary Collective. You can head on over to queertheology.com/community to join. And so just like there's something like it's really important for yourself to know what your values are, because our values can and should guide our actions. And so they actually make decision making easier, because if you like know what your true north is, it gets easier to like know what to say yes or to say no to, or how to react to things, what risks you're willing to take, what you aren't willing to tolerate, when you're really clear in your values. So like knowing your values is a part of loving yourself well. Number 3 for practices for loving yourself, or how you might think about loving yourself in general, and especially in the coming weeks and months as we head into the new year. Do you have practices or rituals that connect you to your deepest value? It is one thing to intellectually know your values. It's another thing to have them written them down like Adrian did, but it's a third thing to really like embody them and have things that you do to like remind yourself and remember them. And sometimes really, practice living those out. I think it was earlier this year, we did a podcast series on rituals for resistance and resilience. And Shannon led us through some teachings about some really like radical roots to many of the Christian rituals like baptism and communion. So if you're interested in learning more about those rituals, I will put a link to those episodes in the show notes. It's at queertheology.com/515. And, I think you will hear Father Shannon and I talk a lot about rituals on the podcast and in emails and on social media, because like that we've just found them to be so meaningful for ourselves and so effective for ourselves, and also so meaningful in the lives of people that we've worked with over the years. I think that rituals can kind of get like a bad rap, right? Where it's like these like rote things that people have been doing for a long time, like kind of like just because, or like to make God happy, but that's not really what pleases God. But I think about spiritual practices and religious rituals as like embodied things that you do with your body to connect you back to yourself, to connect you to other people, and to connect you to your higher power. They are sometimes like little reminders of who you are and where you come from and like what you're doing here. There's sometimes like practices, right? Like if you, in Judaism, we have like a practice of tzedakah, which is like, it's kind of like giving to charity, but it's less sort of like voluntary, or it's less of a like I'm above you and I'm giving down to you charity, and it's more of a lateral transaction of sort of like it is required of us all to take care of each other. And the word for charity and the word for justice are very much intertwined. That's a whole that's a whole tangent that I could go down. If you're interested in like learning more about tzedakah, I don't know, DM me on Instagram or leave a comment on this post on Instagram and say like I want to hear more about that. But like thinking about like when you put a few dollars in the tzedakah box on Shabbat or on a holiday or on the anniversary of a loved one's death, right? Like those few dollars, $10, whatever, few like 25 cents, like whatever it might be, like that in and of itself is like probably like not going to change the world. But and also that like practice of doing that then makes it so that when you pass someone on the street who asks you for money, you're like used to giving money, and so you might be that much more inclined to contribute that money. It might make you more inclined to give to a nonprofit in a larger amount when you're sort of like doing like financial planning time. You might not have much more than that to give, but it might make you more attuned to uh, like the limits of your own ability to give and the need for you to contact legislatures and politicians to make sure that we have like better community care and social safety nets. It might lead you to want to get involved in homelessness advocacy or prison abolition or some other cause that you care about, right? It's like you take this first step, perhaps in the privacy of your own home or in the container of a church service or a synagogue. But in doing so, it's like it makes then the second step and the bigger step that much easier. It is also, I think, like a place where we can center ourselves, where we can actually feel connected to the divine. I know that for many LGBTQ people, perhaps you listening, let me know if this sort of like jives with you. I know that was accurate for me, that there was a period in my life where I felt very, very, very connected to God, that like I had a personal relationship with God. Maybe that like God even spoke back to me. I like never heard voices per se, but I felt like I had this sense of like what God wanted in my life, that God had chosen me, God's purpose for my life, what was like good or bad or aligned with God's will or out of line with God's will. I felt the presence of God. And then there was a period of time as I was sort of like figuring out my queerness and I was deconstructing and reconstructing. Those words didn't exist back then, but that's the process that I was going through. That I had sort of like a very intellectual faith, and it was a very dry faith, and I didn't necessarily feel on like an emotional level or a spiritual level that I was connected to God, that I was connected to the divine. And I had to proactively add back in some religious ritual and some religious practice to help sort of like cultivate that sense. And, I think at first I was a bit skeptical of like, I don't know, like liturgical prayer or incense or rosaries or praying the office. But, when I think about it, and this might be true for you if you grew up in sort of a conservative or evangelical or charismatic tradition. Like we had all of the same sort of stuff, right? We used different words for it, right? Instead of smelling the smell of incense, you might have smelled the smell of a fog machine. There weren't actually fog machines in my church, but I know that they exist, right? Instead of candle lights, we might have had like stage lights. Instead of saying, I don't know, I didn't grow up Catholic, but like instead of saying like Hail Marys or a sort of like a standard daily office, there were definitely songs that were more or less popular that we sang often, tunes that feel familiar. Lord, I lift your name on high, Amazing Grace, but like that sort of like poppy version of Amazing Grace with extra verses intertwined, like songs by Hillsong and Bethel, right? Like there was their words were meaningful, but also there was a sense of like familiarity that was deeply comforting. There was a sense of like doing it all together. When we would like, some people would raise their hands or close their eyes or put their hands on their hearts or put their hands out to their sides, palms facing out, right? Like all of those are things that you do to cultivate a sense of embodied connection to the divine. And I think that it can be tempting to say like, or to think that like, oh, that was just sort of like the Holy Spirit speaking for me, right? As opposed to, no, this was something that I was doing, that we were all doing together to cultivate a sense of connection and a sense of transcendence. And I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. So like maybe that you just do more of that, or you might experiment with some other practices and rituals that help settle your body into a deep knowing and connection to and with the divine. And as I'm talking, I'm just sort of, if this is something that's sort of like jiving with you, if you would like more of a connection with the divine in your body, in your day-to-day life, would you reach out to us on Instagram or by email and just sort of let us know? I know I already asked you to do that once, so I like apologize that I keep asking you lots of questions, but especially when I don't have Shay with me, I don't want this to just be a one-way, talking at you, but I want it to be a two-way conversation. Oh, which reminds me that we have a new platform where we can discuss episodes of the podcast together. That doesn't require you to have social media. If you go to my.queertheology.com, you will be able to create a free account over there, and you'll be able to discuss each episode of the podcast as it comes out, past episodes as well. And there's also a bunch of free resources over there that you can check out on like finding a faith that fits, some stuff on queer calling, a bunch of stuff about sort of like, is it okay to be queer? Diving deeper into sort of like the intersections between queerness and Christianity, queerness and spirituality. That's also where our online community, Sanctuary Collective, and our spiritual study hall live. But it's, again, my.queertheology.com. You can sign up for free. And so like leave a comment on this podcast episode with if this sort of like sense of like wanting to connect more deeply to the divine and have a sense of like an embodied sense of like feeling connected to God. So that was the third one in this section on loving self. Do you have practices or rituals that connect you to your deepest values? I mean, I guess I sort of like wandered on, not just onto your deepest values, but also into sort of like your connection with God. And so then my fourth thing that I would sort of ask myself and ask you as you sort of wrap up this year and head into the next year is, how do you experience the love of God in your life? And as you can probably imagine, based upon what I was saying in this last section around practices, then I think that one of the ways that we can experience the love of God in our life is by cultivating that connection to the divine through practices and through rituals. You might experience the love of God in your life in other ways. And so, whether that's just sort of like being with friends or going to a church or being in nature or whatever it might be for you, how do you experience the love of God in your life? And if you do some reflecting on that and you find that there are like times or places or moments or ways that you experience more of the love of God in your life, like run after those and build more of those in your life. And if you're feeling like, I would like there to be more of the love of God in my life, spend some time figuring out like, what experiments do I have to run perhaps to get more of that? And how can I be gentle with myself with where I am right now? That like I don't know. I just feel like, oh, I could go on and on. There could be a whole episode on my thoughts on the nature of God. We're talking about that inside of Sanctuary Collective as well. But I want every queer person to know that you are whole and that you are holy, and I want you to feel connected to like the source of all being and all creation, and I want you to feel connected to each other. And I feel like my life is just sort of like brimming with divinity. And I see that in a lot of folks that we work with. And I also know that like that wasn't always the case. And that isn't always the case. Like sometimes life fucking sucks, man. And it's hard. Sometimes I feel disconnected from God. Sometimes I'm very doubtful. Sometimes I'm like unsure of myself. And so like if you're in a period where you're like, oh, fuck, I don't know, man. Like I don't know if any of this God stuff is for me. Like that is okay too. Um, I think the sort of like my intellectual answer to that would be like, well, God can look lots of different ways, and perhaps you could reimagine like what God could be in your life. And also like to not know or to feel disconnected or to feel sort of like, this isn't for me. Like that is an okay place to be. If it is like, if that is working for you now, if you need a break, that might be the most loving thing that you could do, is to actively try to sort of like take a break from traditional notions of God and to seek source, connection, love, divinity, wholeness in other aspects of your life. So that is some questions and reflections around loving self. Then as we think about loving neighbors, the first sort of like question I've got for you today. The first is, what sort of relationship, if any, do you have with your literal neighbors, like the ones who live within a few blocks from you? And I'm thinking I'm I'm just like obsessed these days with like our actual like in-person community, and like not even just like I have like friends in Los Angeles that are sort of scattered about the city, but I'm thinking about like the neighbors that I like that like live in my apartment complex. I know like a few of them like decent, like no, like I know like one of them casually, like pretty like pretty well. One of them like quite like a few of them quite casually. But like that feels important. I have like I know I have a friend across the street from me. I have like a few friends within walking distance. Like there's like something about people in your literal physical neighborhood that feel really important in terms of like neighbor is not just a stand-in for like people who are not you, right? Like, there are definitely questions in the Bible about sort of like, who is my neighbor, or who is my brother, or who is my enemy? And I think like neighbor can absolutely be sort of like, I don't know, like a category of people or like a metaphor for lots of different types of people. But I think it also like literally means like, who is your actual neighbor? And there's like something special about and important about that as well. And then also just for like expanding the circle a little bit, what about people who live in your city or your town? What sort of relationship, if any, do you have with them? And how might things be different for you if you like had more connections in your physical space? And then the third sort of like question for consideration when it comes to loving neighbors is, how often do you have conversations with friends that you can be really, truly, fully, completely vulnerable with? And like no censoring. And this one of those friends, if you have a romantic partner, might be your romantic partner. And also, I think it's really crucial that you have like at least one close friend, if not like maybe 2 or 3 close friends, in addition to your romantic partner, that you can be really, truly, fully vulnerable with. And at least one friend that is like your go-to friend and like not your shared go-to friend with your partner. Because just like the reality of life is that like sometimes you're going to have like points of tension or stressors or like with your partner or questions about your partner. And this doesn't mean like your partner's a bad person or that it's a bad fit or that your relationship is on the rocks or that like one of you is like toxic or anything like that. It is like just the nature of like being in a relationship with another person, like in a close, intimate relationship with another person, that you're just going to sort of like necessarily like bump up against each other sometimes. And so like having a safe place where you can talk about that is like absolutely critical. And the same goes for like not just talking about issues or what's going on in your romantic relationship, but like places that you can talk about, I don't know, like a hard time that you're having at work, or insecurities you're feeling about yourself, stresses that you're feeling, vulnerabilities that you're feeling, shame that you're feeling. Like especially for LGBT folks, especially for LGBT folks like us were raised religious, in particular Christian. Like there's just a lot of shame that like the world has tried to like heap onto us, and like that shit is going to come up. It's not a question of like if, it's a question of like when and how. And so do you have people in your life that like that you can just like be like your raw, authentic self with? And like if the answer to that is like, oh shit, and like no, I don't really, like that is like okay. I mean, it is not an ideal state to be in like for forever. But it is okay that you're there now. There have been like, I will be honest, like within the past like few years even, I moved from New York to LA. I moved at the time with two boyfriends. I broke up with one of those boyfriends. A lot of my social life in Los Angeles revolved around my two partners and my like shared friends with those two partners. And so like, yes, I have like very, very good friends who live other places. Obviously, there's like Shay in Minneapolis, and then in Kansas now. My good friend Asher, who's in Texas. Like my good friend Matt, who's in New Jersey, right? But like those are people farther away, and so like my actual in-person people that I could be like really truly vulnerable with, there was a while where I just like didn't have it. It like sent it like really sucked, and so I did some like a lot of like long phone calls with friends in other places. I like saw a therapist for a little while. And then there's a point where I was like, I gotta like make some new friends. And I actually had to like go out and make that a priority to find people in my physical, like that I could walk to or drive to their house and like flop on their couch and vent to them, and they could vent to me. And so like if you are like not having those deep connections, just like sort of like flag that as like a potential area where you might want to invest some time in cultivating those deep, vulnerable friendships. And then finally, in this sort of collection of reflections around loving your neighbor, like, and in the same line of those friends that you can be vulnerable with, is like, who would tell you if they thought that you weren't living in alignment with your values? So that means like they've got to be close enough to you that they know your values, those values that hopefully you've been thinking through in the previous section on loving yourself, that you've articulated to yourself. Maybe you've articulated to these friends. Perhaps these friends share those values with you. Or like, and even if you haven't like explicitly said like, here are my like 7 top core values, like you just like live them out normally. And so if you're acting in a way that is like incongruent with the way that you normally live and act, and what you say is important to you, like folks are there someone who's going to clock that? So like A, they've got to be able to notice in the first place, and then B, are they close enough to you that they can feel comfortable telling you that they have the strength of their own personal character, that's something that they would be able to flag for you. Are you in sort of a place where you've made it clear to them that that's something that you would be receptive to hearing? And so like those are my end of year thoughts on loving self and loving neighbors, and how those two go hand in hand with each other and with loving God. And they just like feel really important for me, and perhaps for you, and I think for our world, that we cultivate like more love in the world, but not like a shallow, superficial, just sort of like la-di-da love, but like a love that is like rooted in values for those of us that like are people of faith, that is like rooted in faith and morality, and not like some Bible thumper morality, but like our own sort of like the way that we understand divine morality. That loving self, loving neighbors just feels really, really, really important. And so by now, you might be feeling really solid in your love of self and your love of other practices. Or you might be realizing that you've completely neglected both of them for a while now. Or I think more likely, like, you're probably doing really well in some areas, and there are some areas that could use some more attention. I know that's me for sure. It's not like life is never 100% perfect or 100% terrible, even though sometimes like it feels like it's totally terrible, or I'm like skirting on hypomania and I'm like everything is perfect, nothing could possibly go wrong, or like neither of those are really true for most people most of the time. The reality is usually somewhere in this sort of like messy middle. And so like paying attention to the areas that are doing really well and like celebrating that in yourself. In our Queerness Everyday Challenge earlier this year, one of the tasks was to sort of like make a spiritual victory log, where you sort of like recount all the things that you've already done in your life, the little things and the big things. And you've probably done a whole lot of really awesome stuff in your life. If you're listening to this podcast, like not to toot my own horn, but like you're taking at least one step towards a life in alignment with, your values, with your queerness, with your spirit. Like that is, that's at least one victory. The chances are you probably have a lot of them going on. And if you're like, yeah, man, my life is pretty fucking great, that is an awesome place to be. And it's like a really strong foundation to then figure out like, where are the weak links? Where could I be doing more? Where have I been sort of like, like things are fine over there. My relationship with my sister, like that's good enough for now. Or where are you sort of like, oh, I like tweet a lot about social justice, and so that's enough, even though I'm not like, connected to it in sort of like a interconnected, interpersonal sort of way. Whereas that you're sort of like, yeah, I like feel content with God, but like, do you feel like full of spirit? Right. It is a lot easier to sort of like pay attention to the spots where we want to do more, could be doing better, feel like we could improve, when we are coming from a place and a sense of like we're already okay, where like things aren't a total disaster. And so like if that is you, that is an awesome place to be. Like, I don't know. Here's, I think, one of my closing thought as we bring this episode to a close. Don't go away. There's still some good stuff in here, but modern life is hard and full of distractions. And so like taking care of yourself and taking care of others isn't just going to like happen accidentally. You really need to be intentional about making loving yourself and loving others a priority. That can look a lot of different ways. You don't need to set like goals or resolutions or have checklists around loving yourself or loving others or about any sort of other priority in your life, whatever that might be. If goals and resolutions like don't like sound good to you or feel helpful to you, like that is okay. But it is important, I think, that you have at least a set of intentions for what you want out of this, like one wild and precious life, to paraphrase Mary Oliver. Because like work is going to be there, the bills are going to be there. Like for me, like rent payments are going to be there, mortgage is going to be there, like family commitments, if you are connected to your family of origin, are going to be there. Like your friends are going to want something of you. There's people are going to pull at you in different ways. Politics are going to be happening around us, right? Like it is just really easy to sort of like get swept into the flow of things. And so like having some sense of intentionality for like, maybe not like for forever, right? Like you don't need to make a 10-year plan. You don't even have to commit to like a year-long resolution, right? Like what do you want to focus on for like the next season of your life? Whether the next season of your life is like between now and the end of the year, whether that is like between now and like, I don't know, maybe the spring, and then you'll like reevaluate come springtime. I'm a big like sort of like springtime reinvention. Things are coming back to life. I'm coming out of my depression. That feels like a time for me. Like I can commit to like, I don't know, like one or two areas of focus between now and, I don't know, like April, whenever Lent or Easter or Passover is, right? Like that sounds like manageable for me, but some sort of intention. And so take a moment. I would invite you to take a moment right now, or like in 5 minutes or however long this episode is, but like immediately after this episode, take a moment to reflect on your past year and on your core values and on practices that you could do to support or practices that support you, or practices that could support those values and those intentions that you would like to either continue doing that you're already doing, that you'd like to improve upon, maybe that you would like to start doing fresh in the coming months. And if you don't have time, like right now or right after this episode ends, instead just like pull out your phone or your calendar or your planner or your bullet journal, whatever it might be, and schedule 30 minutes, a 30-minute block at some point in the next week or two to do this. If you need a hard deadline, you can actually join us for our second annual end of year intention setting call. So that is like a specific date when it will happen. It will not pass you by. It's happening on Sunday, December 17th at 5 p.m. Eastern, which is 10 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time. And so in that call, Father Shea and I will walk you through some exercises to help you clarify your values and get realistic about your priorities and set some simple intentions to help you live into those values and those priorities in the coming year. Again, it's happening Sunday, December 17th at 5 p.m. Eastern, which is 10 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time. We did this last year. It was a hit. It was kind of last minute. We just like shot off an email, see who wanted to hop on Zoom and do it. And we had so many people want to be part of it that we actually ended up having to do like, I forget the exact number, but I think it was like 6 back-to-back calls of like, a small group each in order to keep the group small. And so in order this year to keep it more manageable and more intimate and more sustainable, we're holding it inside of Sanctuary Collective. It will still be a live call. It will still be just a small group of folks getting together to talk about intentions and reflection for the past year and intentions for the year to come. So if you are a member of Sanctuary Collective, you will be it's already sort of inside of Sanctuary Collective waiting for you. If you aren't already a member, you can go to queertheology.com/community to register. Once you log in, you'll be able to RSVP for the intentions call. You'll get the link to join in there. You can cancel after the 1 month if you would like. There's like no obligation to continue. Just join for 1 month for this intentions call if that's all you want it for. But inside there's also like this thriving community of folks. So we'd love to see you inside of Sanctuary Collective. If you have any questions about Sanctuary Collective or about this intentions call, shoot us an email or send us a DM on Instagram. Again, queertheology.com/community to get registered in time for the call. And if you want a place to discuss this podcast, my.queertheology.com. So we will talk to you next week. See you soon and hope to see you inside of Sanctuary Collective real soon. Bye, friends.